Edward III was King of England for 50 years, making him the country's second longest reigning medieval king behind Henry III. Born at Windsor Castle in November 1312, Edward's arrival into the world was certainly welcome news for his father, Edward II, who had, just months earlier, been deprived of his close companion, the widely despised Piers Gaveston, who was executed by the English nobles. The birth of little Edward would have made his father feel a little more secure on the throne, but as the future showed, that stability wouldn't last. As Edward II continued to anger his nobles and his own Queen Isabella, it became obvious to most that the king's incompetent reign must be brought to an end and quickly, and that would mean Prince Edward in his early teens stood to become king. Joining his mother on her return to England from a self imposed exile in France, the powerless Prince Edward could only stand by and watch as his father had his crown forcibly taken from him, becoming a prisoner to Queen Isabella and Roger Mortimer in the process. These would have been hugely disturbing days for the younger Edward, now King Edward III, and he would have known he'd never see his father alive again. Edward III was crowned King of England on the 1st of February 1327, with Edward II dying at Berkeley Castle in September of that same year. But even though he were now the king, Edward III remained under the overbearing control of Isabella and Roger Mortimer, the latter acting as though he were the king. The high point in Edward's first 3 years as king was his marriage to Philippa of Hainault in 1328. Edward and Philippa formed an almost instant bond and were happily married for over 40 years. Still, the insulting nature of his mother's and Mortimer's regency continued until finally, in 1330, the now 17 approaching 18-year-old Edward made his move. Sneaking quietly into Nottingham Castle one dark October night, Edward arrested Roger Mortimer and had him hanged despite Queen Isabella's pleas. Isabella herself would be forced into retirement, with the young king furious with his mother. Only later on in Edward's reign did the relationship between mother and son heal to some extent. Although he'd been king in name for 3 years, Edward's reign only truly began with the overthrow of Mortimer and Isabella. Edward began to show his capabilities as king by leading campaigns against the Scots, but of course it was against the French where Edward would really make a name for himself. Edward's mother was a daughter of Philip IV of France, tying Edward close to the French crown, and so he declared his intention to become King of France. This was rejected by the French, as Edward's claims were centred through the female line of his family. Thus, the so called Hundred Years' War began. The initial phase of the conflict very much went in Edward's favour, as he enjoyed victories both on land and sea, most famously at Crecy in 1346. Edward's dominance over the French lasted until the French crown was taken by the capable Charles V in 1364, and Charles reversed most of Edward's conquests. Edward's campaigns have often been heavily glorified, but the stark reality was, by the time of his death in 1377, England had very little to show for its efforts on the continent, and indeed was now very much at risk of the conflict arriving on English shores. Edward had dragged the nation into a long, difficult, expensive, and perhaps unwinnable war, although Henry V later on came closer still to conquering France. For many historians, it seems impressive victories in battle are enough to rule Edward III as one of England's greatest kings. But in reality, to begin a war, you have to have something enduring and positive to show for it, and instead, the consequences for England of Edward's declaration of war on the French were, in fact, actually rather more dire than has often been portrayed. The Romanticism of Edward's reign has only been aided further by the founding of the Order of the Garter in 1348, coupled with his glorious victories at Crecy and Poitiers. Edward had developed a perfect reputation as a chivalrous king, but this is fairly superficial. The nature of Edward's reign took a dark and sinister turn with the arrival of the Black Death, wreaking terrible havoc across England and Europe. In the north, the Scots had heard of the terrible outbreak in England, and attributing it rather foolishly on God's judgment of the English, attempted an invasion, only to fall foul of the plague themselves. The plague posed terrible dilemmas for the king. Firstly, it posed a risk to Edward's military and political ambitions. Indeed, his own daughter Joan died of the Black Death in Bordeaux, as she went to marry a Castilian prince, later known as Peter or Pedro the Cruel. And in England, the plague caused even wider problems. With the population severely reduced, there was a natural decline in peasants to carry out essential everyday tasks, resulting in prices and wages inflating at shocking rates, to the horror of the upper classes, who were fearful of being left out of pocket. Edward was pressed into action by Parliament and passed legislation to prevent wages from increasing and returning them to levels that the country was accustomed to, in the king's own words. Unwittingly, though, Edward had set the country on a path to social discord, with the lower classes furious at being denied the opportunity to lead more comfortable lives with increased wages. In 1369, Queen Philippa died. For 40 years, she had stood by her husband, a steady, calm woman with a personality that was warm and beloved not only by Edward, but by the country as well. Her death sent Edward's reign into further decline. Once an imposing, impressive figure, Edward III became a shadow of his former self, enfeebled and vulnerable to the sweet talk of selfish courtiers who only sought their own personal enrichment. As Edward lay dying in the summer of 1377, having suffered a stroke, Alice Perez, the mistress of the old king that he had turned to for comfort in his final years, slipped the ring off the king's finger as he took his final breaths, and left the room without so much as looking back. Edward III was left to die, abandoned by the world, with only a single priest to comfort him. He left England in a position of weakness, with the French threatening invasion. Edward's successor, his grandson, Richard II, has often been criticised for his lack of desire to continue the war in France, but actually, Richard's more diplomatic approach looks more like a common sense decision, and the young king would soon have to deal with the fallout of the discontent that had grown through his grandfather's reign when the peasants' revolt stormed across the south of England in 1381. It's popular to criticise Richard II, and almost sacrilege to speak a bad word about Edward III, but the fact of the matter is, the reign of Edward III was not the glorious period